Okay, hi online people. Do you guys just mind typing in the chat, just making sure that you can hear me? Just say, yeah, I can hear you. Switch. Cool. All right. Hi, everyone. So this is going to be kind of an extension of the lecture. So it's not really vital that you have access to a computer, because that always gets a bit chaotic when you're trying to do what I'm trying to do on the screen. So today is recorded and it's going to be edited like one of the videos that you receive later. However, feel free to follow along if you want to. I probably won't be stopping and letting everyone catch up though, because it is going to be recorded. But it's worthwhile just being very quiet during this, so that during the recording, there's not a lot of background noise, because that'll just be frustrating for everybody trying to watch the video if there's people chattering in the background. Questions are allowed, and I'll repeat the question so that the recording can hear it. That's really valuable for me and everyone else if you ask questions that you think everyone else will have. And additionally, I'm going to be going over what we're going to be doing in class today, later. So it's worth listening for that reason too. And then you can kind of workshop your maps that you're going to be creating during class. And if you do that during class, then you'll actually have less work to do during the week. You'll get a bit of a head start. So it's worth listening. It's worth getting started today. And yeah, this should be really fun, hopefully. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to go over to a map that I made during my master's. And this is the kind of thing that, obviously not quite maybe as complex as this, but this is the kind of mapping exercise that we'd sort of expect you to be doing for this exercise. So this map is kind of a series of individual drawings that I've made in Rhino. You might recognize this, you might not. It's Wentworth Park. And so this is kind of our site over here along the foreshore edge. And there's Roselle Bay over to this side here. And the focus of my master's was Wentworth Park. And so the particular focus of this map was to explore all the different historical objects embedded throughout the site during, over its industrial history. And I wanted to kind of characterize and redesign each one of the historical objects. So the focus of my map was to illustrate those industrial elements. And so you'll notice that there's a lack of additional context. So there's a lack of contours, there's a lack of ecology, there's a lack of sort of contextual housing in residential areas. And a lot of other detail is completely blank in this map, because that wasn't the focus of my map. The focus of my map was to draw all the historical artifacts. So things like the old coal loader, which used to take coal from the ships, the schooners and things in the bay, and transport them onto rail networks to distribute the coal into Sydney. Things like the coal storage bays that used to store coal, the incinerator that used to burn down rubbish in the bay that kind of released huge amounts of kind of pollution into the air, the modern day cement factory that's still there today, the viaduct that's also still there today, and this bridge that kind of was connected to the industrial network as well, the quarry, and so on and so forth. And so there's a whole series of objects that I was exploring, and I drew them in ways that I thought represented what I wanted to discuss about each object. So you'll notice that some of the objects are in axonometric view, whereas others are in plan view. Sorry guys, just over here, just like I said before, the noise really does carry into the recording, so it's worth just staying quiet for the next sort of 20 minutes, thanks. And so I drew each object in a way that represented what I wanted from the object, and what its kind of important characteristics were. So the reason I'm going over this is because when you're drawing your maps, it's worth considering exactly what you want to be representing and ensuring that that becomes the focus of your map and not additional, maybe unnecessary contextual information. So for example, if you're focusing on birds and perhaps a tree species, you might not wish to draw objects that that bird would not interact with. So in your case, the contents of the bay and the water, unless it's a fishing bird, might not be important to you, and the canopies of the trees and the bird paths might be more important. And then vice versa, if you're drawing fish and you've got an aquatic plant then the contents of the bay are going to be exceptionally important. And the things outside of the bay won't be as important. So think about what you want to illustrate and try and draw the focus of your map onto that. You'll also notice around my Rhino file is a whole series of additional objects that didn't make it into the final map. That's okay. It's okay to draw things that you decide to aren't worth including in your map. And this is a process of elimination. There's actually a lot more, but I ended up sort of deleting them because they got too big on the file. So it's a really nice exercise to draw a whole series of objects and then just include a few of them. And that's kind of a curating process. So what's the most important object to me? How can I design and curate this map to be a communication device for the subjects that I'm talking about and not kind of overload the map with unnecessary information? Good. So the first thing I did, and this is what we're kind of asking you to do first as well. It's a nice contextual exercise that allows you to kind of frame the map in a certain way, is to draw the coastline of your map, of your bay rather. And that's what I did as well with this map. And there's a whole range of ways you can draw a coastline. I personally traced it from a series of different maps. And the secondies are going to be saying, you can get it from these different programs. There are plenty of ways to be getting a coastline through mapping software and other means. But I think tracing it is a really fantastic way of getting the exact level of detail you wish to get from your map. And I'm going to go over that in just a second. So in this particular map, I drew the existing coastline, which is in blue, which I just selected here. And this coastline is kind of characterized by a series of hard built infrastructural edges. So we've walked this site. You've probably walked it a few times by now. And it's a highly curated, highly developed coastline that has a series of footpaths that allow us to walk along it. But obviously this wasn't always the case. This coastline has changed a series of times over its history. And so here, what I just selected now is the coastline that was theorized to have existed before colonial settlement, so prior to 200 years in this area. And you can see that it's a vastly different coastline. And so I was, of course, exploring the 200-year history of the site. So putting both of these different historical coastlines into my map was important to draw the distinction and to create almost a timeline of what's happened in this site. And of course, this coastline has changed a multitude of times in between those two spaces. Yeah, sure.
So for those in my class that are like kind of drawing a few different section lines that show the historical stuff, so you would kind of do this and find a way to correlate the map's information with your section information. Maybe that's through color or a particular kind of hatch or line weight, but it'd be kind of like super interesting to, use the same kind of line type, but then also thinking about if you could bring your section into that part of the map where this historical stuff meets the present day life.
Exactly. And there's also a quick note to notice that your organization with layers obviously becomes exceptionally important during this process as well. And so I've exercised the exact same techniques that we've taught you here. There's nothing more complicated about what I've done in my layer organization than what you've already done with your Rhino files. So obviously each of these has got a series of folders, and there's folders within folders, and they're all labeled. And that allows me to be really precise about what line weights I'm using. And I can't lose track then of any of the content that I've got. So if I wanted to look at the racing track, I'd find the Greyhound racing track layer, which is somewhere, and then all the layers within there. And so we expect this level of kind of organization and detail. Yeah.
When you have the folders in your Rhino line work, does that get exported in the Illustrator as well?
It's a great question. I'm about to go into that right now. So that's perfect. So obviously, and some of you may have noticed this, that if you've got folders within folders, and so on, and you export those from Rhino to Illustrator, what you get, so this is the Illustrator map, is in your layers panel, it kind of organizes itself like this. So it'll say the folder name, and then it'll have a series of semicolons, and then the additional folder name, so fish market, shell oil, substructure. Now, obviously it gets pretty extreme in Illustrator when you've got all your folders that don't go into all your layers that don't go into the folders like this. And at first it's incredibly daunting, but what you'll notice is they actually are organized. So all of my Wentworth Park border folders and layers are here, and all the sub layers are all kind of documented within there. And it's important to not create folders in Illustrator, so you can do it. So for example, if I drag this folder into, that layer into that layer, it becomes a sub layer. But there's a whole series of Illustrator settings that get affected by that. So it's actually not a good idea to have layers inside other layers and create sublayers. It's better to leave them outside. That way you can edit the layers more precisely. If you've got sublayers, they get affected by things like opacities and it gets really complex. It's worth just leaving them all out in the open. And yes, it does create a big daunting folder panel, but that's honestly better than the alternative. Unfortunately, Illustrator hasn't quite figured that out yet. So yeah, the other thing I added to this map, obviously when I got to Illustrator, was things like text. So little stories about the structures as I went. And this is something else that we think would be really wonderful to add to your maps as well. So if you've got some writing or you're writing a narrative as well about your creature, your plant or your action, you can put little blocks of text, just like we were doing in the transect and section in 81. So all those different qualities come through. And you can notice there's a very limited use of color as well. So just some sort of beige colors, black and white, and tiny bit of sort of pink color. Those colors were really important to my masters. And so I kept them through the mapping. But it's obviously a highly restrained use of color. And this is the kind of level of color that perhaps we expect or want in your maps as well. So just very highly restrained, highly selective colors. What do the colors mean? What are they important for? And perhaps we can go through that individually with each student as you begin to add different things to your work. So obviously there's not things like, that's okay. We didn't do things like the water is blue and the grass is green, because that didn't add a lot of contextual information to the map. And I wanted to create a sort of a less clear distinction between the water and the land. I wanted to almost be a single homogeneous space. So that's why I didn't color the water a different color, for example. You might decide something similar to that. Anyway, so Tom, how do you draw a coastline? There's a whole range of ways, like I said, and I'm going to go through a series of kind of mapping browsers that are really fun and useful. Let me just, sorry, the zoom bar is really annoying on the screen. Okay, so the first one, of course, that we all know is Google Maps. And in Google Maps, I'm sure you know as well, is you can change the display setting from this kind of schematic view to an aerial photo. And in the aerial photo, you can go over to the setting, you can go more, and you can turn off the labels, which I'm sure most of you would know by now. That creates a slightly more easy to use map. So the main thing to consider when drawing your coastline first is what scale do you want to draw your map at? So if I was to view the coastline, say, of Rosedale Bay, which is, this is approximately our site here. If I viewed that from this distance, it's quite a simple shape. It's quite a general curve at this scale. Then as I zoom in closer, more and more detail becomes revealed. And so if I was tracing this map, it's really important to scroll to a distance that's suitable for the level of detail that I want to include when I start to screenshot it, or however you want to import it into Rhino. So the further and further I zoom in, the more and more detail is revealed. Obviously, to a certain point, Google Maps is a little bit fuzzy when you get a bit this close. But the main thing to kind of get across here is, well, two things. The first thing is more detail is added the closer I zoom in. So that's important to consider how much of the coastline you're drawing. But also in a lot of areas, where the coastline actually is a little bit obscured. So it's quite clear when you're thinking about these hard edges and this kind of concrete finish, the coastline is this point, that's quite obvious. But if I get to somewhere like the mudflat, depending on the tidal height, the coastline is actually going to be in a different spot. And this is an important distinction to begin to make as you trace your coastline. So is the coastline here where the tide is kind of deepest at the moment? Is it over here where it was on the day that we visited? Or is it when you meet the boardwalk? And what kind of authority does the boardwalk have to say that that's the coastline now? Is it actually further back where the old historical mudflat used to extend to? Or is it all the way up the old historical river? Where actually is the coastline here? It's highly obscured. So this quickly turns from a simple tracing exercise to a critical reflective exercise. It's not a matter of just tracing the coastline because that's not very clearly defined anymore, is it? So those are really important things to consider. And obviously at the forefront of that consideration is going to be your action, your fauna, and your flora. So what does this coastline mean for your creature, your plant, and your action? Maybe the coastline, if you've got a fish, it's actually more important to be drawing it out here where the deeper water starts. Maybe your fish can't actually get to these kind of intertidal zones where the water's really shallow, and your fish's coastline is actually way out here where the bay is at its deepest. Maybe you've got a crab and its coastline is, this is its whole world. and it doesn't actually leave this mud flat. And that's the most important part, and you want to focus on that in great detail. Maybe your bird doesn't care about this kind of coastline at all, and it's actually thinking about where the trees are, and that becomes your coastline. Maybe if your bird goes fishing, think about where the coastline is for your creature and your plant by extension. So that's Google Maps. The other cool program is Google Earth, which has got this cool, neat 3D view of the whole planet. If you haven't been on Google Earth before for some reason. I mean, this is a really big deal when I was growing up. It might be less of a big deal now. So here's Australia, and obviously you can zoom into where we are in Blackwater Bay, which is here. This has a slightly higher res view of the coastline, so you can zoom in quite close. So you can actually get, a little bit more of that detail, but it still gets pretty fuzzy, but it actually allows you to zoom in a bit closer than Google Maps does. So that's another great program for kind of getting a bit of additional detail. And it also has a series of kind of tools. So it has kind of a measuring distance tool. So if I go over to this side panel here, I click on the little ruler, and Google Maps does have the same feature. That's a highly inaccurate feature. This is slightly more accurate. You can measure out distances on the map. And so when you're tracing, it's worth finding an edge that's really clearly defined, say maybe this edge here, and measuring that out and going, okay, that's 22.44 meters. So when I go into Rhino, I want to draw that line at a 1-to-1 scale, probably, when I'm drawing this in Rhino. Maybe I'll start with that edge. And then as I draw the rest of the coastline, you're then drawing the full coastline at a proper 1-to-1 view. And I might make an additional quick video about that a bit later, because that's going to be quite important. But hopefully that's a relatively simple concept to understand. You want to probably draw this map at 1-to-1. So measure a hard edge that's clearly defined. In fact, I probably recommend doing this edge, and then draw that edge at 1-to-1. So draw it at 22.2 or 44 meters, and then try and draw the rest of the coastline at a 1-to-1 scale. Good. And there's a range of other tools that I probably won't go into now. Yeah, that's the next thing. Yeah, it's okay. Another really great aerial map program is called 6 Maps. This has a much, much higher quality aerial map. So if I zoom in a bit closer, you can see that, it's slightly more high quality. So you can actually get individual rocks and kind of cool details. It doesn't have the same measuring capabilities as Google Earth, so it's worth using both of those programs to get an accurate measurement of your foreshore, and then using this base map to get a higher res version. And so I imagine a strategy here would be to create a series of screenshots, tile them together, and then draw the coastline at a kind of highly detailed level. But the other really great thing about 6 Maps is it also has inbuilt historical map data from 1945. So you can actually slide the scale and get a series of transitions, I guess, to a 1945 aerial view that was taken by a plane as it flew over Blackwater Bay, a series of other spots in Sydney. So how to get that up is in the top right corner. If you click on base maps, you can, there's a bunch of original settings, but if you click down here, it says looking for 1943 or other imagery. I don't know why it's so obscured, but you need to click on that. And then you can click on the 1943 imagery, which will be one of these boxes, but I already selected it. That's why it's over here now. So once you've selected your 1943 imagery, when you click on base maps, these two settings will appear: New South Wales imagery and Sydney 1943 imagery, and a slider. And as I slide that down, it'll slowly transition from New South Wales imagery to Sydney 1943 imagery. So if I do that slowly now, you can see that the coastline slowly changes, a few additional objects are created, and here's what the coastline actually looked like in 1943. So there are a few kind of key differences in this kind of historical mapping. So, and it's not the highest quality because it was taken out of like a literal camera hanging out of an aircraft. But you can see things like there's a shipwrecking yard here. So this is where they used to take old ships to be taken apart. Yeah, take care of that. Sorry, someone's chatting again. It does carry, just keep that in mind, thanks. Almost done. So yeah, there's a whole range. The coastline has slightly changed. This was a timber mill or a timber yard, and another ship repair yard over here. And if I scroll back, so if I go back to today, this is where we walked. This was a highly pedestrianized edge is when we were there, lots of people running and lots of dogs and things. Whereas historically, it's been a privatized space. And so it's only very recently that people have been able to access this foreshore. You can see that the mudflat is kind of still there, but it was used to kind of dock ships. So it had a very different use. And of course, the entire footpath around this section has been taken up by warehouses. There's a whole range of really interesting things like, I mean, it's just fun to explore. These are the old incinerator bins where they used to store trash before they would burn them. And you can see they're still there today. And that's the incinerator that used to burn heaps of, I think like metric tons of waste every day. It's pretty insane. So if you're looking at kind of historical things and you want to see where the vegetation or how the vegetation's changed or how the foreshore has changed, that's a really great tool. Another thing you might want to do is you might want to be looking at foreshore edges that you can find through historical imagery. So if you type in Blackwattle Bay historical map and just go to Google Images, oops, not maps. You'll pretty quickly find a whole series of, actually it's real big rows over there, aren't we? So it's typing Blackwattle Bay. There's a whole series of kind of diagrams and other imagery that kind of suggest the historical coastline, how it's changed to the modern day coastline. There's different views of the edge. So this is a rotated view where you can kind of see these old abattoirs that used to line the edge. So this is from 1913. So this is well before that imagery that we saw just a moment ago. So you can kind of go even further back, further into history. And there's an image that we were looking at on 6 maps. So you can start to incorporate a whole range of different imagery into your map as well. And do you want to go into clipping masks and things? Is that worth it now? Or? Yeah. Is this all making sense? If I were just going over maps and things, is this quite clear? Any questions based on anything I've said so far? Oh yeah, sure. Yeah. Cool. So just to kind of illustrate how this all might work. And again, we've kind of seen and done this kind of thing before. But if I go on to, so if I'm on PC, it's the snipping tool to create a screenshot. If you're on Mac, it's Command-Shift-4 to create a specific screenshot selection. So if I go new and I screenshot perhaps this mudflat, I can go File, Save, I can label it mudflat, put it into downloads. This is all the same process that we've done for the previous exercise. So if I create a new layer and I call it mudflat image, make that my active layer, and I go picture, go to downloads. I can place my mudflat into Rhino, create a new layer, call it coastline 1, and maybe you want to create a series of coastlines. I'm going to create a layer called coastline 1. I'm going to lock that layer, I'm going to make this layer red. And so just to demonstrate what I mean by kind of using scale and kind of that changes how we draw the coastline, my first instinct to draw the mudflat might be to go, okay, so that's the mudflat there. So maybe I'll draw kind of a curve that follows the mudflat like this. Cool. And that's my coastline. But if I actually zoom in further, I can see that slightly in an obscured capacity, that mudflat is actually more detailed than my line suggests. And so the kind of detail that we want to see is you going in and making a really kind of perhaps abstracted interpretation of what that coastline might look like. So turning on my end snap there. So creating kind of, oh, and there's another setting that's turned on. Just going to make that really slow. Yeah. Also, this is a really big file, so you can see my curve prediction thing is really delayed. And so creating a more detailed coastline, depending on kind of exactly what you're illustrating. Oof, that's really slow. Then obviously using the appropriate tool for the appropriate object. So if I want to create a new kind of layer for the concrete edge, make that kind of a nice blue. Then for that kind of edge, if it's a straight edge, and this is something that we saw a bit in AT1 that we want to kind of snuff out, is using the right tool for the right kind of job. So where before I was using a curve tool to create a kind of a wavy edge for a kind of a more ephemeral thing, I want to use something like a polyline to trace a hard edge, which when I draw creates a straight line. And I want to make sure that it doesn't connect to that point there. And then kind of draw very clearly, kind of, meet the edges up so they're kind of almost 90 degrees. And you can do that more specifically, trim those away. And then we're creating kind of different characters for the different edges and the conditions that we're creating. So the mud flat is very clearly defined by this kind of wavy, more ephemeral sense, whereas the concrete edge is very clearly defined by being kind of a rigid surface. Then you can start to get really kind of fun and start to add things like movement into your drawing. So if I go water edge, how might you go about drawing where the water stops? So that could be kind of overlaying your mud flat with like an area where you think the water might be going up to. So maybe the water kind of actually extends beyond where I've illustrated the edge of the mud flat, or an even more kind of ephemeral way. And this is maybe a bit of my own self coming into the drawing too much. I like to draw things like kind of very clear kind of ripples on where the water might be kind of breaking up against the mud flat, and maybe you can start to break those boundaries of the mud flat by kind of illustrating kind of ripples and things in the water. And what that ends up looking like in Illustrator, as we know, is kind of, these kinds of details. So lots of like kind of, look, I did this a long time ago, so don't judge me, but like lots of kind of ripples and kind of additional details. So even as you zoom into the map into Illustrator, you get more detail. Yeah, Noah?
What's the difference between folders and sublayers? You said not to use folders.
Yeah, that's a great question. So Rhino uses folders. So if I drag one, so maybe I'll create a new. Yeah, no, sorry, that again, it's a very good question. These aren't actually technically folders. This is a personal definition. So yes, they're called sublayers in Rhino, and they're also called sublayers in Illustrator. However, I kind of like to define the Rhino version as folders because they actually act more like folders than sublayers. So if I go new layer and I call it edge condition, I can actually drag all of those layers into that layer and they become sub-layers. You can do that in Rhino. This is where it gets a bit confusing. It's a good idea to do this in Rhino, but when you get to Illustrator, it's not a good idea to do it because the settings start to affect one another. And if you start to edit lines as sub-layers, they actually also edit the parent layer as well.
When you import it from Rhino, will it not automatically put it into folders?
No, so the way it imports it into Rhino is it renames. Yeah, so when you import it into Illustrator, it renames the layer with the folder connection. So it goes foreshore stairs, side stair, and so on and so forth. So how this would come into Illustrator is to say edge condition, semicolon, coastline 1, edge condition, semicolon, concrete edge. So it's kind of its own organizational system. Yeah.
Just going back to bringing in the picture and having it scaled 1:1 correctly.
Yeah.
So if it is 22 meters, we want it to be 22 meters in Rhino. So it's going to be much bigger than the initial scale.
Exactly. Thanks for bringing that up as well. So in terms of scaling it, I'm just going to remove this stuff out of the way. There's, again, a whole range of ways to scale it, but a nice kind of easy digestible way to scale it would be to go, okay, so I know that this edge, because I measured it in Google Earth, was 22.44 meters. That's not the actual distance because I just measured it really quickly, so do it yourselves. What I would do is, so I know my Rhino files in millimeters because that's the setting that I told you all to set your precedent for. I'm just going to double check that because that would be really awkward if it wasn't now. And so there's a bunch of ways to check. What I quickly to check is just go distance. So my settings are in millimeters. So what I would draw is I draw a line and I'd start it at a really clearly defined point here. So maybe I'd start it there. and then hover my mouse over the direction that the line is going to continue in. And then it's 22 meters. Let's just keep simplify it. So it'd be 22,000. So, is that right? Yeah, 220,000 millimeters. That's correct. And so it's actually not super far off, because I think I was drawing my map at 1:1. So potentially, hopefully. So now I would unlock my image. I'd select my image and I would type in scale. So that'll make sense. So that line is now 22 meters. Type in scale, then select that endpoint there. And I've got the image, sorry. So I've got the image selected. Type in scale, select the endpoint of my line, then select where, so you can turn on maybe intersection actually, where the line and the image intersect, and then drag that point to the endpoint of the line. And now my image is scaled at 1:1. It's a really like jank way of scaling, but it's fast, it's easy, it's very digestible. And there's a ton of ways to do this, but this is a nice, fun, easy way to do it. That's what I mean. So you should be drawing with your images at 1:1. Is that clear for everyone? Does that make sense? Nothing too complicated there, right? Nice. Cool. So let's say I traced out some vegetation in my image. I'm going to do this really quickly because I don't want to spend too much time doing this. This is not how you would do it, but I'm going to draw a circle around my tree. Now, if you were drawing vegetation, obviously a circle is a good way for a construction plan to see what a tree is. And it's very clearly a way of going, hey, construction builders, this is where you place the trees for my design. However, when we're drawing a tree for a kind of communication sense, you want that tree to be kind of characterized in a certain way that's going to communicate what you want to communicate about that tree. What all that means is draw the tree in an intentional way. So how you kind of draw the canopy might not be an incredibly accurate canopy, but it needs to be detailed, it needs to be precise, and it needs to kind of evoke a sense of what that tree actually looks like and is doing on the site. So with all that being said, you'd have to have a very, very good reason for drawing a circle to represent a tree. I hope I don't see any, but if I do, I want a really good explanation as to why you did that. Anyway, let's pretend that I drew this really, really precisely. Actually, a quick example of how I drew trees was I drew them like this. So I didn't want trees to be the main focus of my drawing, so I drew them very kind of simply. So all I did was I drew an outline of the tree and then a few kind of details of the edge. And that's not true. I drew them with a bit more detail than that. I think these trees were more important than other trees, right? I don't know. Figure out how you want to draw your trees. This is how I did them for this example. But this is kind of what I mean is I drew them kind of in like an axis of what the trunk, like the root system looked like as it was kind of reaching the ground condition, and then what the soil looked like around the tree. And then I drew the canopy. So it kind of became like a plan and an axo in the same drawing. But that's the kind of thing is like, you know, the canopy is not the most important part of the tree, depending on what your creature is, right? You might be looking at the trunks instead. And so how do you represent trees by not drawing the canopy? It's a whole other question. That's what we mean by illustrating things in a way that is relevant and associated with your creature or plant. Anyway, let's pretend like I do this properly. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to, I would export this circle into Illustrator. Wait, let me reverse it. I'm going to go over really briefly how to do clipping masks in Illustrator. This is a really useful tool when working with imagery in Illustrator. And if you want to cut certain things out of the images that you're finding, it's a really, really fantastic tool. So I'm just going to close this. Create a new image, new artboard rather. And I'm going to change this to such as classic file place. So let's say there's my mudflat image. If you wanted to, again, there's a whole other video to be made about scaling things down. You guys have gone over scaling briefly in Studio, right? Do you understand the principle of scaling? Do you know how to scale in Rhino to specific scales? You don't? Okay. Might be worth making a separate video about how to do that.
Oh, wait, yeah.
So do you know how to, so I don't need to make a video about scaling? Or?
Yeah, I think Fergus has one.
Fergus has one? Like if I wanted to scale my map to 1 to 1,000, you guys know how to do that.
Well, only with a map that we already like.
Knew the scale of.
Yeah.
Well, you know the scale of the map that you're drawing because the scale is 1 to 1. So it's quite easy and nice to scale from 1 to 1 to a certain, maybe I'll make a video about it anyway. I don't know, let me know if you want a video on that. Anyway, let's pretend that I imported my image and I imported my circle from Rhino. So that would look something like this. There's my circle that I drew in Rhino. I'm just going to make it white so it's easy to see. If you ever lose anything in Illustrator, by the way, you can select window at the top. I went over this briefly in my last video, but all the different panels and things are here. So if your layers aren't appearing for some reason, I mean, they're actually here. But if you want to find them, you can just go window, layers. Or if you're on Mac, you go layers into help and it finds it for you. I don't know why PC doesn't have that function. Anyway, so what I would do is I'd have my circle on one layer and my image on another layer. So let's say this is the circle that I drew. So just for clarification, there's my circle. This is what it would look like if I exported it properly into Illustrator. Let's say I wanted to cut out the tree with my really precisely drawn canopy outline. So the image that I have in my base map is just the tree, right? What I would do is I will select the image and I'd hold shift and I would select the vector that I exported from Rhino. Then there's a hotkey that I use to do this. I've actually forgotten the other way of doing it. I just always use the hotkey. That's right. You go make clipping mask. So you select both your objects, just the two objects for starters. Right click and go make clipping mask. What that'll do is it'll cut out the image that's underneath your vector and just include what's inside the vector, right? So if I undo that, my vector is on top of the image. You can see that my vector layer is above my image layer, right? So very clearly hierarchy. Think of it like a cookie cutter. You've got your dough laid out on your table and you get a cookie cutter and you smack the cookie cutter onto your dough carefully. And then you get a nicely shaped cookie, right? You can't do it the other way around. So the clipping mask has to work in the same way. So this is my cookie cutter. This is my dough. And then the hotkey I like to use is Command 7 or Control 7. And that cuts out the image. There's obviously a whole range of things you can do with this. This is the most basic form of that. But you can start to get really, really complicated. So if you've got a really, really intricate drawing of your coastline and you want to have a really high resolution cut out of the water, you would have your vector tracing the water, and then you would use a clipping mask to then cut that out. I can do that in a whole range. Yep.
You have the vector underneath the image layer, would it invert instead of just have an empty circle?
It would look like this. So there's my vector underneath my image. I select them both. I go Command 7. It says can't make the clipping mask. That's all that happens. So it's not like it'll destroy anything. It's just like an error. Then you go, okay, so I just drag my vector on top and then do it. Command 7. Simple as that. If you've got multiple vectors, it also gets a bit confusing. So if you want to cut out multiple things at once, you can actually do it. And because we're recorded, I'm going to go through it. Let's say I've got 2 circles and I want to have all my trees cut out maybe, but I don't want to have to do this image a whole range of times. Like I don't want to have to import the image, import my vector, cut out each individual tree. I want to do it all at once. What I would do is I'd select both of my vectors first. Then I'd right click and go make compound path. What this does is for the program, it tells the program that these are actually the same line. So I go make compound path, nothing changes, except when I select them, they should both select. Now, if I select my image with the vectors on top and go Command 7, they both cut out the image in their relative spots, right? Now, the reason the compound path is so important is if I do release compound path and I do something like group, I don't believe that's going to work. You get an error as well. So it's important to go compound path. To make it extra confusing, but also kind of fun and a bit more advanced, let's say my 2 lines are overlapping each other and I wanted to actually combine these 2 vectors together. What I can do is I can go to my window panel and open a panel called Pathfinder. That's what this looks like. And And you see there's a whole range of kind of diagrams down here. These give me a whole range of tools to start to combine vectors together. So if I select one vector and select another vector, see how they're overlapping and they've got that kind of space between them. If I select perhaps intersect, it creates a vector of just the two internal vectors. If I undo that and select minus front, it's going to cut out one circle from the other circle. If I go unite, they become the same vector and they become linked together. And if I go exclude, I don't know exactly what that does. That can be really cool. So if you've got a whole range of overlapping contours and you want to go trim in Rhino, I can actually take those vectors into Illustrator and cancel them out here. And then obviously they're the same vector now. I don't need to make a compound path or anything out of them. They're literally just the same one single vector. I can also make a clipping mask out of that. The other thing you can do with clipping masks is, I mean, the good thing about clipping masks is the image is never deleted. It's just reduced to what's inside the vector. So it's always going to be there. That means I can go back and edit the shape later and it's not going to destroy anything. Yeah.
Sorry. What happens if you move the path?
Yeah. So great question. I can move this around and it's not going to change where it is on the image. However, if I select my vectors and I double click on them, it opens up an editing, see how it says, somewhere it should say isolation mode, yeah, on my layers panel. All the layers go hidden and it goes into isolation mode. I can then move my, my vectors around and it will show you different, and the image by extension as well, and I'll show you different spots on the image. So this is a good way of kind of quickly editing where your vectors are kind of isolating the image as well. If you're super overwhelmed by any of this, don't worry, it's recorded. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Any questions?
Like this. This is why we say like I'm not a big fan of Photoshop, because otherwise when you do this on Photoshop and you delete with a magic wand, it's like kind of gone forever. Whereas here, if you change your mind about how you draw it, you can directly edit the lines. You kind of grow on that if you decide to change what the tree looks like. And that's just by going to that tool.
Curvature tool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because with Photoshop, this is like a Control-Alt-Delete, Control-Delete for ages until you get there.
Yeah. And we're going to release a whole bunch of videos about how to use Photoshop as well, because it's got some really neat tools for this kind of exercise. Yeah, I might do that in the video. I mean, so what Fed's saying is a really good point, is you can, before you take the images into Illustrator, you can edit the images in Photoshop, like make them grayscale and kind of add fun colors and additional content to your images, and then take them to Illustrator and then use clipping masks on them. So you kind of not just use base maps that you've taken from 6 maps, but also edited base maps that you've gone through Photoshop with. So it can get really neat. Then obviously Photoshop's got a range of different tools like opacities. So if I select my vector and I can reduce the opacity of that image, I can start to obviously create kind of opacities on the base map as well. Yeah.
We actually then use it.
Yeah, it's a great point.
Or is that what I left was just actually.
Yeah, and so essentially what you're going to be starting with is the vectors of your map. So it's going to start as a line work drawing. But what's going to start to be quite interesting is if we start to incorporate things like historical maps embedded underneath our map. And so maybe I can actually show you an example of this.
So is that what you use the clipper for?
You could, exactly. Yeah.
Then why do you need Rhino for not just drawing straight?
The reason Rhino is so useful in that process is because you can get really precise to scale vectors as well. So that I drew these, for example, coastlines in Rhino, exported them, then overlaid them onto my images, and then cut them out. So
multiple times in one file.
Yeah.
Add an image.
Yeah.
Add a line, and then
you can do it as many times as your computer can handle it. So for example, just to kind of demonstrate that, again, in the last video I released, I showed you how you can hold Alt and duplicate images really quickly in Illustrator. What this means is these are all individual images. If I go release clipping mask, that's its own image, that's its own image, that's its own image. So you can have as many images as you want in your Illustrator file. The only limitation to that process is your computing power. And it can start to get, and that's why it's a good idea to have multiple vectors over the same image so you don't tax and overtax your computer. So an example of a base map over a map, I was just going to show them my Antarctica map.
We just do it here. Yeah,
It's kind of, yeah, I mean, it's kind of a nice way to show, I think.
Yeah.
I'm just going to take my computer off the screen because this is my Google Drive. Just bear with me for 1 sec. If I go to maybe if there's any other questions, now would be a really great time to ask them. So what we want to do today, actually, maybe I'll just go through it now, is during class, when we go upstairs, kind of nowish, I think it would be a really good idea for you to start to find out which coastline you want to be drawing, how you want to draw it. And if you've got a laptop, actually start to just draw your map. If you don't have a laptop, it might be a good idea to get a piece of paper and start to illustrate how your map might look, what kind of objects you think you'd want to draw. And so as we're going around today, looking at the work you've done over Stuback, yeah, it's a good idea to just get a head start on the mapping program. And I know obviously after studio, you're all probably quite tired, but this is going to be really valuable because then you can go home and just chill out. And you've already started the exercise.
chill out.
This afternoon they could, but then tomorrow they get straight back into it. Oh my gosh. The other thing to note is that it's really, really important to stay up to date with each of these tasks. So if you're sitting there and you haven't done any work over Stuback and you haven't started your sections, you now have to start the mapping exercise and do the sections in 1 week. Okay, and that's just going to compound every week until the submission. So I don't like telling students to stress because I think it's counterproductive, but it could be one of those times where you would start to stress if you haven't started doing any work yet. Sorry. So this is an example, Noah, of what we would do with the base map. This is a map of an ice shelf in Antarctica that I made of an ice shelf in Antarctica. Yeah, so the Amory ice shelf, which is here. And actually this is kind of a good example of what, in a way, would be nice for you guys to start doing as well in terms of the method. So here is another kind of narrative that I've created. Once again, it's someone over here that's talking. This is a story about an algal bloom off the coast of Antarctica, and scientists called it the behemoth. That wasn't my name for it, but it's a cool name. And it was a novel algal bloom in 2012. And I wanted to tell the story of how this algal bloom formed. The way it formed was kind of iron deposits on the surface of the snow were blown off the Antarctic ice shelf by a type of wind called catabolic wind, which is a wind that goes from the center of Antarctica and off the coast. And so these orange arrows are the direction of the catabolic winds that were blowing the iron off the snow and into the water. And this particular current of wind influenced the iron in such a way that there was a large deposit of iron on the surface of the water in this exact area. And that led to one of the largest algal blooms that's ever been recorded. This is like absolutely massive. I can't really illustrate it in this map. Sorry. This particular species fed on iron, as well as a couple other minerals that I kind of illustrated further into the map, but it kind of created the perfect conditions for this algal bloom to form. Then other creatures started to use the algal bloom as kind of a feeding ground. So fish started to eat the algae. So krill started to eat the algae, fish started to eat the krill, and then seals started to eat the fish. So it created this like 2-week, really intense ecosystem. And this map is about telling that story. So if you've got a kind of an interesting narrative you want to start to tell, think about all the different characters and influences that are kind of relating to your creature, and then try and tell that story in a map in this way. But to answer kind of the basic question again, how would I use a base map in my image? This is Antarctica on the left-hand side. And to kind of give it a bit of historical context, which is another part of the story, is I just found a historical map of Antarctica. And I drew out the coastline. Actually, I got it from a mapping program. And then I cut out the historical map of Antarctica there. So all that stuff that's underneath and that kind of opacity, that's a historical map that I found. And that helped me kind of tell my story. And you can see there's actually another map cut out of the ocean floor here. And so that adds a bit of kind of historical context. So you might, get a base map, cut out the coastline and have a historical map underneath, your Blackwater Bay maps, or you can do whatever you want. That probably concludes the lab. Yeah. Any questions based on any of that before we go upstairs and have a look at your work? Did it, yeah, make sense? Is that kind of clear? No one's freaking out, super confused. I mean, we can troubleshoot that stuff upstairs as well. Cool, let us know. So let's go upstairs now. I realize I forgot to keep track at the end of the map. It's a record. This is what the map looked like for the video. Have your stuff ready to be reviewed upstairs. So have your sections ready to have a look at. And while you're waiting for us to chat to you, I can get a head start on your maps. Start to draw your coastlines. And yeah, it should be a nice afternoon.